Example builds on example 1 and example 3. So we'll take the Scupper cluster policy from example 1 and we'll bring aspects of OCM, Open Cluster Management, from example 3. The idea behind this example is to expose a new API, kind of an aggregate API in the hub cluster for managing Scupper cluster policies across multiple clusters. So there's a little architecture diagram here. It's more complex than the other ones, but as I go through the example, I'll highlight different pieces to make it easier to understand. So we'll be working our way from the bottom here upwards to make sense of what's going on. If we focus at the top part first, we have our west cluster and our east cluster. We have our front end in the west cluster, and it wants to communicate with the back end in the east cluster. We have a Scupper router set up on both clusters. There's a Scupper link set up, but we haven't exposed the back end to the front end yet. In fact, as we go through the example, when we try to expose it, that won't be allowed, just like in example 1, and we'll need a Scupper cluster policy to allow us to do that. The difference with this example is we're going to use the policy framework in OCM to help us manage those Scupper cluster policies. So I've already deployed the front end and the back end, so we can skip these steps here. I'll move straight on to try and curl the front end, and we should get an error here, name or service not known, as the front end can't contact the back end yet. So let's clear that, and let's curl. So we see our error here, name or service not known. So if we attempt to expose the back end, we'll get an error about the policy validation. Deployment backend cannot be exposed. So far, we're following the exact same steps as example 1. Here's where it differs. We're going to deploy a new controller that can reconcile this new API, this MultiClusterServicePolicy API. So this is very much a proof of concept, but the idea is to show, well, what can we do leveraging the policy framework in OCM and something that abstracts the Scupper cluster policy. So let's run these couple of commands here and we'll deploy this particular controller. If I jump back to the architecture diagram, what I've deployed here is this piece, the MultiClusterServicePolicy controller. I should say that the hub cluster, it already has these other pieces installed, the OCM policy and placement controllers. There's a few different things running there, and we do have the policy add-ons. I think there's 2 different add-ons enabled in both of these clusters here that are registered with the hub. So we have these controllers in place. We have our MultiClusterServicePolicy controller deployed now. And what we're going to try and do is create a MultiClusterServicePolicy, and we'll have a look at the YAML of that. We'll reference a placement to place it onto these 2 clusters, and we'll work our way up here and explain what's actually happening here. What is the controller down here doing to interact with OCM? So let's create a few resources here. Just to set things up, we have a managed cluster set binding. So that's an OCM thing, and that's to set up a particular namespace where we can put resources that target a particular managed cluster set. So they're OCM things. Let's get those 2 created first, and then I'll talk about the placement on the MultiCluster service policy. So we're going to create the placement first. So let's jump back to the diagram. The placement as in where do we want to place our multi-cluster service policy? Where do we ultimately want to place our scupper cluster policies? That's what the question is. So let's have a look at our examples. And we have a placement in here. And we're not very picky here. In our predicates, we have a label selector, and we're not specifying which expressions to match. So it's actually going to select our default one, our default managed cluster set. In this case, is going to go to both the east and the west cluster. So we're not being picky, just send it to both. But we could tailor that if we wanted. So that's the placement we're going to create. Let's create that, and then we'll have a look at the multi-cluster service policy. So this is the new API that this controller manages. So first of all, there's a few fields here that we've pretty much just taken out of the SkupperClusterPolicy and brought it up here to the hub level, to that kind of overarching level. And we've also introduced the placement ref field in here. So we're kind of saying we want the SkupperClusterPolicy that has these particular values, and we want to place it on clusters according to what this placement actually matches. So let's go ahead and create that. So back to our architecture diagram, we have the multi-cluster service policy created. It's referenced in placement to put it on both clusters. Our controller is going to do a couple of things. It's going to create or map that multi-cluster service policy into an OCM policy over here. So there's a particular structure there that OCM expects, and that policy is going to reference our placement via a placement binding. So our controller is creating just these two things here, the policy and the placement binding. Once we have them in place, the OCM policy and placement controllers take over after that and do everything needed to ultimately get the Scupper cluster policy in both clusters. So it's already gone and done that. But let's have a look at that. Let's have a look at that policy and see, is that compliant now? So looking at the policy that the controller has created, we can see a few fields here before we look at the status. The structure that has these policy templates. In here we have a configuration policy, and in there we have our object templates, and this is actually where the Scupper cluster policy is. And we can see the fields that it's put in here. Some of them are defaults and some of them are what we've specified. Jumping down to the bottom here, we can see that the status of this policy, this OCM policy, it says that it's now compliant. Here's the placement that it's referencing, and here's the two clusters that it is placing those resources on. So the Scupper cluster policy should now be on both clusters because this policy is saying it's compliant. So let's try and expose the service again and see if it'll let us. I'm going to expose the backend to the front-end service. Okay, so it allowed us to expose that service. Just to round things out, let's try to curl the health endpoint. And we get our OK response. So just to summarize things back in the architecture diagram, what we've ultimately ended up with is we have our Scupper cluster policy on the west cluster, the east cluster, and we were able to expose our backend to the front end. The way we got the Scupper cluster policy in both those clusters is via the OCM policy and placement controllers, but ultimately it was the multi-cluster service policy API that let us do that.